My husband said, "I am filing for divorce and leaving you for your best friend." He took everything. I lived in my car, but a notary called me. "Ma'am, your father died and left you $85 million, but there is one condition." Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had everything. A house in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. A pale yellow colonial with white shutters and a Japanese maple in the front yard that turned crimson every October. A husband named Derek who coached youth soccer on weekends and made Belgian waffles on Sunday mornings. A best friend named Cassandra who had been in my life since the 7th grade, who held my hand when my mother died, who was the maid of honor at my wedding 12 years ago. I was a graphic designer, working from home, building a small but steady client base. We didn't have children. That was a wound of its own, a quiet grief Derek and I had learned to carry separately. But I thought we were solid. I thought we were real. Looking back now, I wonder how long I had been choosing not to see. The first sign came about 14 months before everything collapsed. I noticed Derek had started locking his phone, not hiding it exactly. He left it on the kitchen counter, on the coffee table in plain sight, but locked. He'd never done that before. We were the kind of couple who knew each other's passwords, who shared a Netflix account and a grocery list app and a calendar that synced automatically. Suddenly, there was a 4-digit wall between me and whatever he was doing at 11 o'clock at night while I was already in bed. I told myself it was nothing. People valued their privacy. I valued mine. The second sign was Cassandra. She started canceling our standing Thursday dinners. We'd had them for 6 years, rotating between her place and mine. First it was a work thing, then a family thing, then just vague, apologetic texts. "Can't make it tonight, so sorry, rain check?" I missed her. I texted more than she replied. I assumed she was going through something and waiting to tell me in her own time. That was what I always did with Cassandra. I waited. I gave her room. I trusted her completely. The third sign I can only name now, in retrospect. Derek stopped arguing with me. That sounds strange, I know. But we were a couple that disagreed. About money, about whose family we'd visit for Thanksgiving, about whether to repaint the dining room. Small, ordinary friction. It had always been there. And then, slowly, it wasn't. He became agreeable, patient, almost gentle. He stopped pushing back. I remember thinking, maybe we're finally growing up. Maybe 12 years had smoothed us into something quieter and better. It had not. I started waking up at 3 in the morning for no reason I could name. I would lie there in the dark beside Derek, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, and feel a cold, formless dread sitting on my chest. I couldn't explain it. I had no evidence of anything. I just felt like a woman standing in a house that had already been sold, who hadn't been told yet. In the spring, I had a small freelance project that took me to Raleigh for 2 nights. Derek drove me to the airport, kissed me at the curb, said, "Call me when you land." I called. He didn't answer. I told myself he was probably at the gym. When I came home early, the second day's meeting had been canceled. The house was quiet and clean and empty. Nothing was out of place. Derek came home 90 minutes later with Thai food and a plausible story about running errands. I ate the pad Thai. I said it was good. I watched his face across the table and looked for something I could point to. I found nothing, not yet. But 3 weeks after that, on a Tuesday evening in April, Derek came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I remember the sound of him clearing his throat, and then he said it, flatly, without drama, as though he'd rehearsed it so many times that all the emotion had been worn away. "I'm filing for divorce, Sarah, and I'm moving in with Cassandra." I turned off the faucet. I stood very still with my wet hands and the dish towel hanging from the cabinet handle and the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me. Cassandra, my best friend since the 7th grade, the woman who cried at my wedding, the woman who knew every quiet, private, breakable thing about me. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet and thought, how long? He didn't answer that question. Not that night. Maybe not ever. At least not honestly. But that question would end up mattering less than I expected, because within 72 hours of that conversation, I would understand that the divorce was only the beginning. What came after it was something I hadn't seen coming at all. The days after Derek's announcement were a kind of controlled disaster. He didn't leave immediately, which was somehow worse than if he had. He slept in the guest room, spoke to me in the polite, careful tone of a man who has already emotionally vacated a marriage and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He ate cereal standing at the kitchen counter in the mornings and left before I came downstairs. He took calls in his car in the driveway with the engine running, and I sat inside the pale yellow house with the Japanese maple and felt the walls get smaller every day. The attorney I called that first week, a woman named Patricia Holt, recommended by a colleague, sat across from me at a glass desk in an office building downtown and laid out my situation with the kind of measured compassion that comes from delivering bad news professionally. Derek had moved faster than I realized. He'd already retained his own lawyer. He'd already begun the financial documentation process. North Carolina was not a community property state, but it was an equitable distribution state, which meant assets would be divided based on a judge's assessment of fairness. And Derek, it turned out, had been quietly restructuring those assets for months. The joint savings account, the one I thought held $47,000, had been drawn down to just over $4,000 through a series of transfers Derek had made to a personal account I didn't know existed. The investment portfolio we'd built together over 11 years had been moved into an LLC he'd formed in Delaware 18 months ago. The house was mortgaged against its equity, something he'd arranged during a refinancing I'd signed without reading carefully, trusting him the way you trust a person you've been sleeping beside for over a decade. Patricia looked at me across the glass desk and said carefully, "Mrs. Calloway, your husband has been planning this for a long time." I drove home. I sat in the driveway. I couldn't go inside yet. Was this what those locked phone screens had meant? All those quiet, agreeable evenings? Had Derek been sitting across from me at the dinner table, smiling over Thai food, while he systematically dismantled the financial life we had built together? And Cassandra, had she known? Had she been part of it? I thought about her canceling our Thursday dinners. I thought about the texts that came less and less frequently. I thought about her standing at the front of the church at my wedding, holding a bouquet of white peonies, smiling at me as I walked down the aisle. That was when the grief turned into something harder. I won't pretend it happened all at once. Grief doesn't work that way. It comes in layers, and the layer that looks like anger is usually just the grief that has learned to stand upright. But somewhere in that driveway, in the silence of a late April afternoon with a neighbor's lawnmower running in the distance, something shifted in me. The part of me that wanted to cry indefinitely stepped back. The part of me that needed to think stepped forward. I had very little money. I had a mortgage I couldn't cover alone. I had a freelance business that generated enough to live modestly, but not enough to survive a legal battle with a man who had been hiding assets in a Delaware LLC for a year and a half. But I was not, I reminded myself, without resources. I had Patricia Holt, who'd been in family law for 19 years and who I suspected had seen worse than this and won. I had a paper trail, because Derek, for all his planning, had been careless in small ways. I'd found an email confirmation, printed accidentally and left in the recycling bin, referencing a wire transfer. I had access to our joint tax returns for the past 11 years. I had screenshots I'd taken quietly over several evenings of bank statements that still showed in our shared financial app before he removed me from access. I had 3 banker's boxes of documents I'd spent a week assembling on the dining room table, organizing by date and category with the same precision I used for client design projects. And I had something else. Something I hadn't told Patricia yet because I was still processing it myself. 2 weeks before Derek had made his announcement in the kitchen, I had received a voicemail from a man who identified himself as Thomas Whitfield, a notary and estate attorney in Savannah, Georgia. He said he was calling regarding the estate of my father, Robert Allen Marsh. He said my father had passed away. He said I was named as the primary beneficiary of the estate. He said I should call back as soon as possible because there were conditions attached. I had not called back yet. I had listened to the message 3 times, standing in the hallway of the house that no longer felt like mine, and I had not known what to do with it. My father and I had been estranged for 19 years. He had left when I was 16, moved to Georgia, built a second life with a second family, and contacted me exactly twice in 2 decades. Once on my wedding day, a card with no return address, and once 4 years ago, a brief, awkward email that I had answered politely and then never heard from again. I did not know my father had money. I did not know he had been watching my life from a distance. I did not know he had been thinking about me at all. But that voicemail was sitting on my phone, and now, in the driveway of a house I was about to lose, I finally understood that it was time to call Thomas Whitfield back. Before I did anything else, I needed to know what the condition was. I called Thomas Whitfield the next morning, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Panera Bread 3 miles from the house, because I didn't want Derek to overhear. Thomas Whitfield was in his late 60s, I guessed. His voice had the unhurried cadence of a man who had been delivering complicated news to grieving families for a very long time, and had learned that patience was not a courtesy, but a professional necessity. He expressed condolences about my father. He confirmed that Robert Allen Marsh had died of cardiac arrest 7 weeks earlier at his home outside Savannah. He had been 68 years old, and then Thomas told me about the will. My father had left an estate valued at approximately $85 million. The assets included real estate holdings in Georgia and South Carolina, a portfolio of regional commercial properties, and a substantial investment account. He had updated his will 4 times in the past decade. The most recent version, signed 11 months ago, named me, Sarah Ann Calloway, née Marsh, as the sole primary beneficiary. I sat in the parking lot and felt the ground shift beneath the car. $85 million. But Thomas had been right about the condition. The will stipulated that in order to receive the inheritance, I had to be free of any claims from a current spouse at the time of distribution. My father, Thomas explained carefully, had watched his own estate be partially consumed by a bitter divorce in his 50s, and he had built a specific legal provision designed to prevent the same from happening to me. The inheritance could not be transferred to any individual who was currently in active divorce proceedings in which a spouse might assert a marital claim on the incoming assets, which meant that if my divorce from Derek was not finalized or was still legally active, by the time the estate went to probate distribution, Derek's attorney could attempt to argue that the inheritance was a marital asset. I stared at the windshield. Derek had filed before I received this information. He had filed, or so his attorney claimed, 6 weeks ago, which meant that at the time of my father's death, I was already a woman in the early stages of a divorce. Whether Derek knew about the inheritance, I didn't know yet, but the timing made my stomach turn. I asked Thomas Whitfield how long we had. He told me the estate would likely move to distribution in 4 to 5 months, pending court processing. That was my window. I drove directly to Patricia Holt's office without an appointment. Her assistant tried to reschedule me. I sat down in the waiting room chair and said quietly but clearly that I would wait as long as necessary. I waited 2 hours. Patricia saw me. When I finished explaining what Thomas Whitfield had told me, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This changes everything." We began moving immediately. Over the following 2 weeks, I did 3 things that I told no one about. Not a friend, not a family member, not anyone who might inadvertently mention it to the wrong person. First, I hired a forensic accountant named Gerald Sims, recommended by Patricia, who specialized in asset tracing in divorce cases. I gave him my 3 banker's boxes and every financial document I had managed to compile. He was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who looked at the Delaware LLC paperwork and the wire transfer confirmation I'd found in the recycling bin and said only, "This is going to take me about 3 weeks. Don't move the money you have left." Second, I quietly stopped using the joint bank account entirely and opened a personal account at a different bank. I transferred my freelance income into it. I began documenting every expense on a shared credit card so there would be a record. Third, I started paying attention. Derek was still living in the guest room. He was still leaving early and coming home late. But now I noticed things I'd been too stunned to notice before. He was on his phone constantly, texting with a speed and focus that didn't match the unhurried, deliberate Derek I'd been married to for years. He took several calls in the backyard. Once I heard him say the word timeline through the closed kitchen window, and something in his voice was tight and urgent. He was coordinating with someone. I was almost certain it was Cassandra. And then, on a Thursday evening in early May, the confirmation I'd been building toward arrived. Not from Gerald Sims, not from a legal document, but from a mistake. Cassandra sent me a text. It was clearly meant for Derek. It said, "She still hasn't called the notary back, has she? We have more time than we thought." I read it twice, 3 times. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. She knew about the will. She had known about it before I did, which meant Derek had known too, which meant the filing. The divorce that Derek had supposedly decided on out of love for Cassandra, out of whatever story they'd been telling themselves, had been at least partially timed around the inheritance. I took a screenshot. I emailed it to Patricia. I texted Gerald Sims a single line. They may have known about the estate before I did. Look for any communications. Then I sat very still in my kitchen and understood that I was not dealing with a betrayal born of ordinary desire or careless cruelty. I was dealing with people who had made a plan. And I had been, for a few weeks at least, the only one at the table who didn't know the game was already being played. That was no longer true. Gerald Sims needed 3 weeks. He used every one of them. When he called me into his office in late May, he had assembled a 74-page financial reconstruction document that traced Derek's asset movements with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years watching men try to hide money and had become very good at finding it. The Delaware LLC, registered under the name Callaway Meridian Holdings, had been funded through a series of transfers beginning 22 months ago. Not 14 months, as I'd estimated. 22. Derek had begun planning this before I'd noticed the first locked phone screen, before the canceled Thursday dinners with Cassandra. Possibly before he and Cassandra had even defined what they were to each other. The investment portfolio totaled just over $380,000. The hidden account held $61,000 in liquid cash. There were 2 additional transfers that Gerald flagged as suspicious. Payments made to what appeared to be a private investigation firm based in Atlanta, totaling $8,400. Someone had hired investigators. To look into what, exactly? To look into my father, I realized. To find out what he had. I sat in Gerald's office and thought about the text Cassandra had sent me by mistake. She still hasn't called the notary back. They had known about the will. They had investigated it. Derek had moved his assets and initiated the divorce proceedings in a sequence that suggested he had timed it, at least in part, to create maximum leverage, to ensure that when the inheritance came through, he would be positioned to claim a share of it. Patricia filed an emergency motion for forensic financial discovery the following Monday. She also filed a motion to introduce evidence of fraudulent asset concealment, which in North Carolina carried significant weight in equitable distribution hearings. The accidental text from Cassandra, combined with the payment records to the Atlanta investigation firm, began to form a circumstantial case that Derek had advance knowledge of the inheritance. It took 4 days for Derek to find out that we had filed. He came home that Thursday night, and he was not the calm, distant man who had been eating cereal in my kitchen for weeks. He was pale and tight-jawed, and he walked into the living room where I was sitting with a book I hadn't been reading and said, "You need to stop this." I looked up at him. "Patricia Holt is going to blow this up," he said. "You don't understand what you're doing. There's nothing to find." I said, "Then you have nothing to worry about." He stared at me for a moment, and then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Cassandra has emails, Sarah, from before the wedding. Things you wrote to me about your family, about your father. If you push this, she'll use them. She'll make you look unstable. She'll make you look like someone who can't manage money or an estate." I kept my voice very steady. "Are you threatening me with my own private correspondence?" He didn't answer. He went upstairs. The next morning, I received a call from a man who identified himself as Derek's attorney, a man named Robert Fisk, who had a voice like a press conference and the manners of someone accustomed to intimidating people before 8 in the morning. He told me that my aggressive legal posture was creating unnecessary conflict. He said his client was willing to reach an amicable settlement if I withdrew the forensic discovery motion. He mentioned carefully that certain information about my personal history and mental health might become relevant in proceedings if I continued. I listened to every word. Then I said, "Please direct all further communication to my attorney," and I hung up. I called Patricia immediately. She was unsurprised. She had heard variations of this approach before. She told me that the threat about mental health records was almost certainly a bluff. Derek had no legitimate legal basis to introduce unrelated personal history, but that we should document the call carefully and proceed. We proceeded. 2 days later, Gerald Sims filed his forensic report as a formal exhibit. Patricia submitted the accidental text as evidence of potential coordination. Robert Fisk filed a motion to have it excluded, arguing it was a private communication obtained without consent. The judge, a careful woman named the Honorable Catherine Rourke, who I noticed seemed distinctly unimpressed with Robert Fisk's manner, declined to exclude it and allowed both items into the discovery record. That weekend, Derek moved out. He didn't tell me in advance. I came downstairs on a Saturday morning and half the closets were empty and his car was gone. A note on the kitchen counter said, "I'll have my attorney handle the house logistics." I stood in the empty closet doorway for a long moment. Then I called Patricia, confirmed there was nothing I needed to do immediately, drove to a small inn in Asheville that I'd stayed at once years before, and spent 3 days doing almost nothing. I walked. I ate at a diner where nobody knew me. I slept 9 hours a night. I sat by a window and watched the mountains and allowed myself to feel, for the first time since April, something close to solid ground. I needed those 3 days. What was coming next would require everything I had. I came back from Asheville on a Tuesday. The house felt different without Derek's things in it. Not emptier, exactly, but cleaner, as though a low-grade pressure I'd been living inside for months had finally been released. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my laptop and went back to work on a branding project for a small architecture firm in Raleigh that had been waiting patiently for my attention. It felt good to work. It felt like being myself again. The call came 4 days later. Not from Robert Fisk, from Cassandra. I almost didn't answer. I sat and watched my phone ring and thought about every Thursday dinner she had canceled, every vague, apologetic text, the white peonies at my wedding, and the message she had sent by mistake. Then I answered, because I wanted to hear what she would say. Her voice was careful and warm in a way that I recognized immediately as performance. Cassandra had always been a gifted social operator. She knew how to modulate tone, how to deploy warmth strategically, how to make you feel chosen. I had once admired that about her. Now I heard it for what it was. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been wanting to call for weeks but hadn't known how. She said what had happened between her and Derek was complicated, and she didn't expect me to understand right away, but she wanted me to know that she had never wanted to hurt me. She said that if I would just sit down with her, just the two of them, she thought they could find a way through this that didn't have to be so adversarial. I let her finish. Then I said, "Cassandra, all of my communication about the divorce is going through my attorney. If you want to reach me about anything related to Derek or the proceedings, please have your attorney contact Patricia Holt." A pause, brief, but I heard the surprise in it. "Sarah, this isn't a legal thing. I just want to talk as friends." "We're not friends," I said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "Take care of yourself." I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and noticed that my heart rate was entirely normal. 3 months ago, that conversation would have broken me open. Now it felt like closing a door that should have been closed a long time ago. I felt no triumph in it. I felt almost nothing at all, which, I think, was the most honest response available to me. 2 days after Cassandra's call, Derek himself reached out. Not a phone call, a text which felt cowardly and also, I thought, deliberate. Texts were easier to keep casual, harder to record as evidence of intent. He wrote, "I think we both know this has gotten out of hand. I don't want to drag this out. Call me and let's talk about a real settlement. I think we can both come out of this okay." I forwarded the text to Patricia without responding. She replied, "Good, don't respond, let them stew." That week, a woman named Diane entered my life. She was in her early 50s, a friend of Patricia's who ran a small support network for women going through high-conflict divorces. Not a therapist exactly, more of a practical peer support organization that met twice a month in a community room at a Presbyterian church near uptown Charlotte. Patricia had mentioned it once, briefly, and I had filed it away without seriously considering it. But on a Wednesday evening, with nothing but a quiet house and my own thoughts for company, I went. There were 8 women in the room that night. I didn't plan to say much. I ended up talking for almost 20 minutes. What surprised me was not the sympathy. I had expected that. What surprised me was the specificity of what these women knew. Several of them had been through exactly the kind of financial maneuvering Derek had deployed. Hidden accounts, restructured assets, carefully timed legal filings. One woman, a soft-spoken kindergarten teacher named Renata, who had been in a 12-year marriage, described her ex-husband's strategy so precisely that I felt a cold recognition run through me. "They think you won't notice," Renata said, "because they've been counting on you trusting them. They mistake trust for blindness." That sentence stayed with me. I began going every other Wednesday. I began sleeping better. I began, carefully, deliberately, rebuilding the daily architecture of a life that felt like mine. I painted the dining room the color I'd always wanted, a deep sage green that Derek had vetoed twice. I moved my design workspace into the room that had been his home office and set up my equipment exactly the way I wanted it. And I waited. Derek and Cassandra were watching. I could feel it. The occasional car that slowed near the house, the social media accounts of mutual friends that suddenly went quiet when I'd view their stories, the careful, minimal information that filtered back to me through the small social channels we still shared. They were trying to read me, trying to understand what I was preparing. I gave them nothing to read. Patricia called one afternoon and said, "You're remarkably composed for someone in your position." I told her I'd had good teachers lately. She laughed. Then she said, "The hearing is scheduled 6 weeks." 6 weeks. I wrote it in my planner and underlined it twice, and then I went back to my design work and let the afternoon pass quietly and steadily, like water finding its level. They came on a Sunday. I hadn't been warned. There was no text, no call, no message through either of our attorneys. At 10:45 in the morning, while I was in the backyard pulling weeds from the garden bed along the fence, I heard a car door close in the driveway. I stood up. I walked around the side of the house. Derek and Cassandra were standing on the front porch. She was wearing a pale gray dress and her hair was down, and she was holding a small potted succulent. The kind of peace offering that was so deliberately innocuous, it was almost an insult. Derek had his hands in his pockets. He looked tired. He looked, I thought, like a man who had been having second thoughts and had let Cassandra talk him out of them. I stopped at the corner of the house and looked at them for a moment before they saw me. What is this? I thought. What exactly do they think this is going to accomplish? Then Cassandra saw me, and her face arranged itself into something soft and sorry, and Derek looked at the porch railing, and I understood exactly what this was. It was a last attempt to reach me before the hearing. It was a performance of reconciliation designed to destabilize me, to reactivate old affections, to make me doubt whether the path I was on was worth the cost. I walked up to the porch. I did not invite them inside. Cassandra spoke first. She said she knew this was unexpected and she was sorry to show up without calling, but she'd felt like phone calls and texts weren't enough, like the only way to truly reach me was in person. She said she and Derek had been doing a lot of reflecting. She said she understood that she had hurt me in ways she could never fully repair, and that she wasn't there to ask for forgiveness. She knew she had no right to that. She was there because she cared about me, had always cared about me. And she couldn't stand the idea of watching both of our lives get destroyed by a legal process that was going to leave everyone worse off. She held out the succulent. I kept my hands at my sides. Derek spoke next, more quietly. He said that the forensic filing had made things much more complicated than they needed to be. He said he was willing to be reasonable about the house and the accounts. Truly reasonable. If I was willing to step back from the aggressive approach. He said the word reasonable twice and aggressive twice, and I noted that both words were chosen to make me feel as though I were the one creating the problem. The estate, he said after a pause. Your father's estate. Whatever you inherit, that would be yours, Sarah. Completely yours. We're not trying to touch that. And there it was, the real reason they had come. They were frightened of what Patricia and Gerald had uncovered. They were frightened of the hearing. And they had come here with a potted plant and careful words and the ghost of a 12-year friendship to offer me a private deal. Drop the forensic discovery. Accept a quiet settlement. Let them walk away cleanly. In exchange for a promise about the inheritance that they had no legal standing to make, and that I had absolutely no reason to trust. I looked at Cassandra. I looked at Derek. I said, I appreciate you coming in person. My attorney will be in touch. Cassandra's expression shifted, just briefly, just for a second, from soft sorrow to something else, something harder and colder and more honest. Sarah, she said, and her voice had changed too, just slightly. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing. The emails Derek mentioned, the personal ones, we haven't used those yet. There are other things too. Financial things. The way you handled the household accounts. We can make this very unpleasant. I looked at her. You already have, I said. Derek stepped slightly forward. Not aggressively. He would never be overtly aggressive. That wasn't his style. But he moved into my space in a way that was meant to feel like weight. Just think about it, he said. We're offering you an easy way out of this. I don't want an easy way out, I said. I want the right outcome. There was a moment of silence. I watched something pass between them. A look, small and rapid, the kind of communication that only exists between two people who have been coordinating for a long time. Then Cassandra set the succulent down on the porch railing, not gently, and they walked back to the car. Derek didn't look back. Cassandra did, once, with an expression I couldn't fully read. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away. My hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. There was something else in it. An awareness of what they were willing to do, of how far they would go, of the fact that the next 6 weeks were going to be harder than I'd already anticipated. But the shaking passed, and what replaced it was something I hadn't expected. A clarity. A cold, clean, absolutely certain sense of direction. They had come here to weaken me. They had done the opposite. I picked up the succulent. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen windowsill where it would get morning light. Then I called Patricia and told her everything they had said, word for word, while it was still fresh. She was very quiet on the phone. Then she said, "They just made a threat during an informal contact visit while both parties are in active litigation. Sarah, that was a significant mistake on their part." "I know," I said. "We're going to document this very carefully." "I know," I said again. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and thought, 6 weeks. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in July. Patricia and I arrived early. We sat in a conference room adjacent to the courtroom and went through the exhibits one final time. Gerald Sims's forensic report, the bank transfer documentation, the accidental text from Cassandra, the records of payment to the Atlanta investigation firm, and the documented account of the Sunday visit, which Patricia had filed as a formal record of contact and implicit coercion. She had also subpoenaed Derek's phone records for the 14-month period during which the asset transfers had occurred. Robert Fisk had fought the subpoena aggressively. The Honorable Catherine Rourke had allowed it. The phone records had been illuminating. In the 18 months prior to Derek's filing, there were 847 documented communications between Derek's personal number and a number registered to Cassandra. There were 23 calls to the Atlanta investigation firm. There were 11 calls to a Savannah area code that, when traced, connected to an attorney who had done probate work in the same county where my father's estate was being processed. Someone, we believe Derek through intermediary channels, had obtained advance information about my father's estate through contacts in the legal community. It wasn't proven beyond doubt, but it was enough to establish a clear pattern of intentional, coordinated behavior. Patricia spread her hands on the conference table. "They built a strategy around your inheritance before they even told you your father had died. That's what we're showing today." I straightened my jacket. I said I was ready. Judge Rourke's courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the ambient sounds of a municipal building. Robert Fisk was already there when we arrived, arranging papers with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered competence a form of theater. Derek was seated at the opposite table in a dark suit, and for the first time in months, I sat close enough to see his face clearly. He looked older than I remembered. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight he'd underestimated. Cassandra was not present in the courtroom. She wasn't a party to the proceedings, but I knew she was watching through some channel she always needed to watch. The hearing opened with Robert Fisk presenting Derek's position, that the marital assets had been restructured for legitimate tax purposes, that the Delaware LLC was a standard estate planning vehicle, and that there was no evidence of intent to defraud. His presentation was polished, but I noticed, and I thought Judge Rourke noticed, that he spoke very quickly past the Atlanta investigation firm payments, describing them as miscellaneous professional consulting fees, without further detail. Then Patricia rose. She was methodical. She presented Gerald Sims's forensic report in sections, walking through each asset transfer with dates, account numbers, and corresponding phone communications. She presented the payment records to the Atlanta firm. She presented the Savannah phone records. She did not editorialize or dramatize. She simply laid the timeline down in front of the court like a map that had one clear reading. When Robert Fisk cross-examined Gerald Sims, things began to unravel. Fisk attempted to challenge the methodology of the forensic reconstruction, suggesting that the transfer sequence was open to interpretation. Gerald Sims, who had the patient, immovable quality of a man who had been challenged in courtrooms many times, responded to each question with precise, documented answers. He did not get flustered. He did not qualify unnecessarily. He simply answered, and each answer closed another exit. Then Derek took the stand. I watched him carefully. I had lived with this man for 12 years. I knew how he moved when he was confident and how he moved when he was not. He was not confident. Patricia's examination was direct. She asked him about the Delaware LLC. He confirmed he'd formed it. She asked him to explain the purpose. He said tax planning. She asked whether he had consulted anyone about my father's estate before filing for divorce. He said no. She presented the Savannah phone records. He said he didn't recognize that number. She asked him to look at the records again. He looked. He said he still didn't recognize it. She presented a document, obtained through the discovery process, showing that the Savannah number belonged to an attorney named Harold Greaves, who had been retained by a third party to obtain a copy of my father's probate filing in Chatham County, Georgia. The third party was listed as a corporate entity. The corporate entity's registered agent was Derek's attorney, Robert Fisk. The courtroom was very quiet. Derek stared at the document. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "You're saying you had no knowledge of this filing?" "That's correct." Patricia let a moment pass. Then she presented the phone log showing 6 calls between Derek's personal number and Robert Fisk's direct line during the 48-hour period following the Chatham County probate filing. Calls made before Derek had filed for divorce. "Mr. Calloway, these 6 calls between you and Mr. Fisk, what were they about?" "General legal consultation. In the 48 hours after your attorney obtained your wife's father's probate documents." I can't speak to the specific timing, but you've testified you had no knowledge of the probate filing." A pause. He looked at Robert Fisk. Fisk looked at the table. Judge Rourke looked at Derek with the expression of a woman who has heard a great many explanations in her courtroom and evaluates them by the same steady internal measure. "I may have been generally informed. I don't recall the specifics." "You may have been generally informed," Patricia repeated. "I see. And the accidental text from Ms. Fairfield, Cassandra Fairfield, in which she states, 'She still hasn't called the notary back, has she? We have more time than we thought.' Would you characterize that as Ms. Fairfield also being generally informed?" Derek said nothing. Patricia waited. "Mr. Calloway?" "That text," he said finally, "was taken out of context." "What context?" Patricia said quietly. would make that text mean something other than what it says. He had no answer. I sat very still at the plaintiff's table and watched Derek Calloway, a man I had trusted with 12 years of my life, sit on a witness stand and fail to find a single coherent version of events that could survive contact with the evidence we had placed in front of him. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter, something that was closer to grief that had finally been given a shape. Judge Rourke called a brief recess. In the hallway, Patricia touched my arm and said simply, "You did everything right." I nodded. I thought about the pale yellow house. I thought about Cassandra's white peonies. I thought about a man I'd never really known who had left me $85 million and one complicated condition. I thought, it's almost over. Judge Rourke issued her ruling 3 weeks after the hearing. I was in Patricia's office when the call came. She listened, took notes, set the phone down, and looked at me across the desk. She ruled in your favor completely. The ruling was 41 pages. I read all of it that night, sitting in the sage green dining room with a glass of water and the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Judge Rourke found that Derek had engaged in intentional fraudulent dissipation of marital assets through the formation of Callaway Meridian Holdings over a 22-month period. She found that the evidence strongly suggested advance knowledge of the pending inheritance and that the timing of the divorce filing reflected strategic rather than purely personal motivation. She ordered full restoration of all transferred assets, with Sarah Callaway receiving 68%. Reflecting both equitable considerations and the financial harm caused by Derek's concealment. The house was awarded to me. Derek was ordered to pay Patricia's legal fees and Gerald Sims's forensic accounting costs in full. Robert Fisk's conduct was referred to the North Carolina State Bar for review. Thomas Whitfield called the following week. "Ms. Marsh, your father would have been very pleased with how you handled yourself." I stood at the kitchen window, the one where Cassandra's succulent had been quietly growing for 6 weeks, and thought about a man I'd barely known who had built a legal architecture designed to protect me from exactly the kind of person I had married. The inheritance transferred in October. I paid off the house. I established a formal trust. I made a donation, substantial, anonymous, to Diane's Wednesday Support Network. I sent Renata a bookstore gift card with a note that said only, "Thank you for the sentence about trust." She texted back, "I'm so glad." As for Derek, he moved into Cassandra's apartment in South Charlotte. Without the assets he had expected to carry out of the marriage, his financial situation was significantly reduced. He eventually left the architecture firm and was doing freelance project management from home. Robert Fisk received a formal public reprimand from the state bar. Cassandra lost 3 clients from her event planning business in the months that followed, 2 of them mutual friends from college. She posted carefully curated images on social media. I did not follow her. I didn't need to. There was one moment when I allowed myself something close to satisfaction. A Tuesday in November, driving past the church where Derek and I had married. I didn't stop. I just drove past and thought, I survived this, exactly as I was, without becoming something I didn't recognize. That felt like enough. The first full year after the divorce was the quietest of my adult life, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. I stayed in the pale yellow house. In the spring, I had it repainted, warm cream instead of white. I kept the Japanese maple. I planted a kitchen garden and learned, badly and then better, how to grow tomatoes. My freelance business expanded. I hired a sharp young designer named Marcus and took on larger, more interesting clients. For the first time professionally, I had the freedom to be selective, and selectivity produced better work. I went back to Savannah to see where my father had lived. Thomas Whitfield walked me through the property. Live oaks, a tidal inlet, a study full of books. One photograph was of me, around 8 years old, red raincoat, laughing at something outside the frame. I couldn't manufacture simple forgiveness for a man who had been mostly absent. But he had done something deliberate and protective at the end, and I let that sit beside the harder things without needing to resolve them. I made new friends slowly and carefully. I traveled. I drove through the New Mexico high desert at dawn with the windows down and felt something in my chest open up that I hadn't known was closed. Derek and Cassandra lasted 14 months after the divorce. Without the shared goal that had held them together, there wasn't much left between them. He eventually moved to Greensboro alone. Her event planning business continued to shrink. The story of the accidental text had traveled, and people were careful around her in ways they hadn't been before. She emailed me once, said she was trying to become someone she could respect. I read it twice, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. Some doors, when closed, are better left closed. The last time I came to the Wednesday group, Diane hugged me and said, "You came in so scared." I was, I said, but fear doesn't have to be the last word. The Japanese maple turned crimson that October. I was home to see it. But here's what I learned. The people who plan to take from you are counting on one thing above everything else. They're counting on you not knowing your own worth, not legally, not financially, not simply as a person who deserves honesty. Pay attention, document everything, know who you can trust, and verify it. And if the ground falls out from beneath you, stay still long enough to find where the solid parts are, and then stand on those. What would you have done in my place? If this story reached something in you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and thank you, genuinely, for being here with me until the end.